In the bitter winter of 1867 Nebraska, 17-year-old Catherine Mills lay bleeding in an alley, abandoned by the very men who claimed to represent society's finest, until a mysterious outlaw named Ezra Stone wrapped her in his coat and changed the course of both their lives forever. But when that single act of kindness turns them both into fugitives, will Catherine discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is accept that you're worth saving? The scream that split the winter air made every horse on Main Street rear up in terror. Catherine Mills pressed her face against the cold brick wall, trying to make herself invisible as three young men circled her like wolves around wounded prey. Snow fell harder now, covering the blood that had already started to freeze on her torn lip. "Please," she whispered, but her voice disappeared into the howling wind that swept through Millbrook's narrow alleys. "I didn't do anything wrong." Judge Morrison's son, Marcus, grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her hard. His friends laughed as Catherine's head snapped back and forth like a rag doll. The winter of 1867 had been cruel to everyone in the Nebraska Territory, but it seemed especially harsh to girls who worked in the cotton mill for pennies a day. "You looked at me funny during church?" Marcus snarled, his breath smelling like whiskey even though it was only afternoon. "Girls like you don't look at boys like me unless they want something." Catherine's knees buckled as pain shot through her ribs. She had been walking home from Henderson's general store when the three boys cornered her behind the building. Now her groceries lay scattered in the dirty snow, bread, milk, and the small piece of hard candy she had saved up to buy for her little sister. The alley stretched before her like a tunnel of shadows. Wooden crates and empty barrels created hiding spots where anything could happen. The backs of the buildings rose up on both sides, blocking out most of the gray December sky. No one could see them here. No one would hear her if she screamed again. "My pa works hard for every penny," Catherine said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "We don't want anything from anybody." Marcus's hand cracked across her cheek with a sound like a tree branch breaking. Stars exploded behind Catherine's eyes as she stumbled backward into a pile of old newspapers. The other boys, William Henderson from the general store and Peter Hawkins, the sheriff's nephew, moved closer like they were watching a show. "Your pa works in our mill," William said with a nasty grin. "That makes you our property too." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled to her feet. Her brown dress, the only good one she owned, was already torn at the shoulder. Mama had sewn it by hand last spring, working by candlelight after long days cleaning houses for the wealthy families on Hill Street. Now it would never look proper again. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them in tiny tornadoes. Catherine's thin shawl offered no protection against the cold that seemed to cut right through to her bones. Her fingers were already turning blue, but she couldn't feel them anymore. "You think you're too good for us?" Peter said, pushing her back against the wall. "Walking around with your nose in the air like you're some kind of princess." "I never said that," Catherine protested. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they wouldn't listen. Rich boys like these three had already decided what they thought about her. Nothing she could say would change their minds. Marcus pulled back his fist like he was going to hit her again. Catherine closed her eyes and waited for the blow. Instead, she heard the sound of boots splashing through slush, getting closer and closer to where they stood. "What's going on here?" The voice came from somewhere behind Marcus, low and calm but with an edge that made all three boys freeze. Catherine opened her eyes to see a tall figure standing at the mouth of the alley. Snow fell around him like he was some kind of ghost, and she couldn't make out his face in the shadows. Marcus spun around, his fist still clenched. "This isn't your business, stranger." "Maybe not," the man said, stepping forward into the pale afternoon light. "But I make it my business when I see three boys beating on one girl." Catherine got her first clear look at him then. He was older than the boys, maybe 25 or 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that looked like they had seen hard travel. A gun hung low on his hip, and his boots were covered in mud from long miles on horseback. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were the color of storm clouds, and they looked at her like she mattered. The stranger's gaze moved over Catherine's torn dress and bloody lip, then fixed on Marcus with the kind of stare that made grown men step backward. Looks like the girls had enough excitement for one day. Marcus tried to puff out his chest like a rooster, but Catherine could see his hands shaking. You don't know who I am. Don't much care, the stranger replied. But I know what you are. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap. Catherine held her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She had never seen anyone stand up to Judge Morrison's son before. In Millbrook, the Morrison family owned half the businesses and most of the land. People did what they said or found themselves out of work, out of homes, out of luck. But this stranger didn't seem to care about any of that. You boys best move along, he said, his hand resting easy on his gun belt. Before someone gets hurt. William Henderson took a step backward, pulling on Marcus's sleeve. Come on, let's go. She's not worth the trouble. She's not worth anything, Peter added, but his voice cracked on the words. Marcus shook them off, his face red with anger and embarrassment. This isn't over, he told Catherine, pointing his finger at her like a weapon. You remember that. The three boys pushed past the stranger and stomped out of the alley, their boots echoing off the brick walls. Catherine watched them go, knowing that Marcus had meant every word. Rich boys like him didn't forget when someone made them look foolish, and they had long memories for revenge. When the sound of their footsteps faded away, Catherine found herself alone with the stranger. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. His coat was long and heavy, made of good wool that probably cost more than her family made in a month. But there were patches sewn into it here and there, and the edges were worn from hard use. You hurt bad? He asked, crouching down so they were at the same level. Catherine touched her split lip with trembling fingers. The cut was small but deep, and she could taste blood on her tongue. Her ribs ached where Marcus had grabbed her, and her cheek burned where he had slapped her. But she had been hurt worse before, and she would heal. I'll be fine, she said, though her voice shook on the words. No, the stranger said quietly. You won't be. Not if you stay here. Something in his tone made Catherine look up at him sharply. His storm-cloud eyes were serious, like he knew things about the world that she was just beginning to learn. What do you mean? Boys like that don't give up easy, he explained, standing up and offering her his hand. They'll be back, probably with more friends. And next time there might not be anyone around to stop them. Catherine stared at his outstretched hand. Her mama had always told her not to trust strangers, especially men who carried guns and looked like they lived rough. But this man had helped her when no one else would. He had risked trouble with the most powerful family in town just to keep her safe. Why did you help me? She asked. The stranger was quiet for a moment, like he was trying to decide how much to tell her. Let's just say I know what it's like to be on the wrong end of someone else's fist. Catherine took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His palm was rough with calluses, the kind that came from hard work and harder living. But his grip was gentle, careful not to hurt her any more than she already was. What's your name? She asked. Ezra, he said. Ezra Stone. I'm Catherine Mills. Well, Miss Mills, Ezra said, looking around the alley at her scattered groceries. Let's get you cleaned up and see about getting you home safe. He helped her gather up the bread and milk, though most of the food was ruined by the snow and mud. The piece of candy was nowhere to be found, probably trampled under Marcus's boots or blown away by the wind. Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized she would have to explain to her little sister why there would be no treat tonight. Here, Ezra said, pulling a silver dollar from his pocket. For what you lost. Catherine stared at the coin like it was made of gold. A whole dollar would buy groceries for a week, maybe more if she was careful. But taking money from a stranger felt wrong somehow, like it would make her no better than the girls who worked in the saloons on the other side of town. I can't, she said, pushing his hand away. It's not charity, Ezra said firmly. It's payment for services rendered. What services? Ezra's mouth curved up in something that might have been a smile. You kept those boys busy long enough for me to size up the situation. That's worth something in my line of work. Catherine didn't understand what he meant by that, but something in his tone warned her not to ask. Instead, she took the silver dollar and slipped it into her apron pocket, where it felt heavy and warm against her hip. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Ezra said, glancing toward the mouth of the alley. "Like I said, this isn't over. Boys like that have long memories and short tempers. You need to be careful." As if to prove his point, the sound of horses' hooves echoed from the street beyond. Someone was riding hard and fast, like they were chasing something or running from it. Ezra's hand moved to his gun, and his whole body went still as a hunting cat. "What is it?" Catherine asked. But Ezra was already moving toward the shadows, pulling her with him. "Time to go," he said. "Now." The gunshot that cracked through the winter air made Catherine's blood turn to ice. Ezra's hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream, pulling her deeper into the shadows between two wooden crates. Through the gaps in the wood, she could see 3 men on horseback racing down Main Street, their faces grim and their weapons drawn. "Bank's been robbed," one of them shouted as they thundered past. $50 to whoever brings in the thief." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the riders disappear around the corner. $50 was more money than most people in Millbrook saw in a year. Every man in town would be looking for whoever had stolen from the First National Bank. Ezra slowly removed his hand from her mouth, but his eyes never left the mouth of the alley. "We need to move," he whispered. "Right now." "Why?" Catherine asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The way Ezra had gone still when he heard the horses, the way his hand had moved to his gun, the way he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected trouble to find him. "Because in about 5 minutes, this whole town is going to be crawling with men looking for someone to blame," Ezra said. "And strangers make easy targets." As if his words had called it into being, the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks echoed from the street. Voices rose and fell like waves, angry and excited and hungry for justice. Catherine could hear her neighbors calling to each other, organizing search parties, promising rewards for information. "Did you do it?" she asked quietly. Ezra looked at her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something flicker in his storm cloud eyes. "Does it matter?" The question hung between them like smoke from a campfire. Catherine thought about Marcus Morrison and his friends, about the way they had hurt her just because they could. She thought about her father, working 16-hour days in the mill for wages that barely kept them alive. She thought about the banker, Mr. Whitfield, who had foreclosed on the Johnson farm last month and left a family of 6 with nowhere to go. "Maybe not," she said finally. Ezra's mouth curved up in what might have been surprise. "Most people would say it matters a lot. Most people haven't been beaten in an alley today." Something changed in Ezra's face then, like he was seeing her for the first time. "You're not like most people, are you, Catherine Mills?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps came closer. Sheriff Hawkins appeared at the mouth of the alley, his badge glinting in the gray afternoon light. Behind him walked Judge Morrison himself, his fancy coat buttoned up tight against the cold. "Check every alley, every building, every hiding spot," the judge was saying. "The thief couldn't have gotten far on foot." Catherine pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible. The wooden crates that hid them suddenly seemed thin as paper. If the sheriff decided to search this corner of the alley, they would be caught like rabbits in a trap. Ezra's hand moved to his gun again, but he didn't draw it. Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was calculating distances and angles. If it came to a fight, someone was going to get hurt. "Nothing down here but trash," Sheriff Hawkins called out after a quick glance into the alley. "Let's try the livery stable." The 2 men moved away, their voices fading as they continued their search. Catherine let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. They were safe for now. "That was close," she whispered. "Too close," Ezra agreed. "I need to get out of town before they start asking the right questions." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're leaving." "Have to. Staying would be dangerous for both of us." "But what about me?" The words came out before Catherine could stop them. "What happens when Marcus and his friends come back?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, looking out at the snow that was falling harder now. You could come with me. The suggestion hit Catherine like a physical blow. Leave Millbrook? Leave her family, her home, everything she had ever known? It was impossible, unthinkable, terrifying. And yet, where would we go? She heard herself asking. West, Ezra said simply. Away from here. Away from people who think they own you just because they have more money. Catherine thought about her little sister, waiting at home for the candy that would never come. She thought about her mother, bent over her sewing by candlelight, working her fingers to the bone to keep the family fed. She thought about her father, coughing more and more each day from the cotton dust in the mill. I can't leave my family, she said. Then you'll have to find another way to deal with boys like Marcus Morrison, Ezra said gently. Because they won't stop. Boys like that never do. The truth of his words settled over Catherine like a heavy blanket. She had always known, deep down, that her life in Millbrook was a trap. Work in the mill until you were too sick to stand. Marry a man who would treat you like property. Have babies you couldn't afford to feed, and die young like so many women before her. But leaving meant giving up everything she had ever known. It meant stepping into a world she didn't understand, with a man she had met less than an hour ago. I need time to think, she said. Ezra nodded. Fair enough. But don't take too long. Every minute I stay here makes things more dangerous for both of us. As if to prove his point, more voices drifted in from the street. The search was getting closer, more organized. Soon they would start checking every hiding spot twice, and their luck would run out. There's an old barn on the Miller place, about 2 miles north of town, Catherine said quickly. It's been empty since they moved to California. You could hide there until dark. And then, Catherine took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. Meet me at the mill tonight, midnight. If I'm not there by then, go without me. Ezra studied her face like he was trying to read her thoughts. You sure about this? No, Catherine admitted. But I'm sure about what will happen if I stay. The Miller barn stood like a ghost against the white landscape, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. Catherine's boots crunched through the drifts as she approached the weathered building, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Inside, she could hear the soft nickering of a horse and the rustle of hay being disturbed. Ezra? She called softly. Here, came his voice from the darkness inside. Catherine pushed through the partially open door and found herself in a space that smelled of old hay and leather. Ezra had made himself comfortable in one of the empty stalls, his horse munching contentedly on grain he must have carried in his saddlebags. A small fire burned in a metal bucket, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Didn't think you'd come, he said, looking up from where he sat mending a tear in his coat. Neither did I, Catherine admitted, settling down on a pile of hay across from him. The warmth from the fire felt good against her frozen cheeks. I walked home, helped Mama with supper, read to my little sister. Everything normal, like nothing had changed. But something has changed, Ezra said, not making it a question. Catherine nodded. When I was putting Annie to bed, she asked me why my lip was cut. I told her I fell down. She looked at me with those big eyes and said, Mama falls down a lot too. The words hung in the air between them. Catherine had never said it out loud before, never even let herself think it directly. But her mother's bruises, always explained away as accidents or clumsiness, told a different story. Her father's drinking had gotten worse since the mill cut his wages, and when he drank, he got angry. It runs in families, Ezra said quietly. Men who hurt women, women who accept it because they think they don't deserve better. Is that why you helped me today? Because you understand? Ezra was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. My mother used to say that every person deserves to be treated with kindness, no matter where they come from or how much money they have. She died believing that, even though the world never showed her much kindness in return. Catherine heard the pain in his voice and realized she wasn't the only one carrying scars from the past. What happened to her? Cholera when I was 15. After that, it was just me and my father on the farm. He tried to keep things going, but the bank wanted their money every month whether the crops came in or not. Ezra's hands stilled on his mending. When they came to take the farm, he fought them. They shot him down in his own front yard. "I'm sorry," Catherine whispered. "The banker who foreclosed on us was a fat man named Whitfield." "Sound familiar?" Catherine's blood went cold. "Mr. Whitfield owns the First National Bank here in Millbrook." "Same man. Been moving from town to town, buying up property for pennies on the dollar, ruining families for profit." Ezra's voice was calm, but Catherine could see the anger burning in his eyes. "Today I took back some of what he stole." The pieces fell into place like dominoes. The bank robbery, Ezra's appearance in town, the timing of it all. "You came here specifically for him. Been tracking him for 3 years. Millbrook was going to be my last stop before heading to California." Ezra looked at her across the fire. "Then I saw you in that alley." Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that had been locked her whole life. "So what happens now?" "Now I ride west like I planned." "And you?" Ezra paused, studying her face. "You decide what kind of life Catherine Mills wants to live." The question that had been building inside her all day finally found its voice. "What if I don't know how to live any other way?" "Then you learn," Ezra said simply. "Same as everyone else who's ever walked away from a bad situation." Outside the barn, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards and sending snow swirling against the windows. Catherine could hear it calling to her, promising freedom and adventure and all the things she had never dared to dream about. But she could also hear other voices in the wind, her mother's tired sighs, her sister's laughter, her father's cough that was getting worse every day. How could she abandon them to chase after dreams that might turn out to be nothing but fairy tales? "I have responsibilities," she said. "To who? A family that can't protect you? A town that sees you as property? A future that holds nothing but more of the same pain?" Ezra's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is save yourself." Catherine thought about Marcus Morrison's threat, about the way his eyes had promised future punishment. She thought about the mill and its endless, soul-crushing routine. She thought about marriages she had seen, women growing old before their time, beaten down by lives that offered no hope of anything better. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what then? I don't know how to shoot or ride or survive in the wilderness. I'd just be a burden." "You'd learn," Ezra said. "And you wouldn't be a burden. You'd be a partner." The word hung between them, full of possibilities Catherine had never imagined. Not a wife to be owned, not a worker to be exploited, but a partner, an equal. "The money from the bank," she said. "How much?" "Enough to start over somewhere new. Buy a small ranch, maybe, or a business in a town where nobody knows our names." Catherine closed her eyes and tried to picture it, waking up in a place where she could walk down the street without fear, where her worth wasn't measured by how much work she could do or how well she could serve others. It seemed impossible, too good to be true. But then she thought about the silver dollar in her apron pocket, the first gift anyone had ever given her without expecting something in return. Maybe impossible things happen more often than she thought. "When do we leave?" she asked. Ezra smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Soon as you're ready." Catherine stood up, brushing hay from her skirt. "I need to go home one more time, pack some things, leave a note for my family. Too dangerous. By now they know you were seen with me. They'll be watching your house. Then I'll have to be careful." Catherine moved toward the door, then paused. "Ezra? That coat of yours. The one you were mending. What about it? Would you let me borrow it? Just until I get back." Ezra looked puzzled but handed over the coat. It was still warm from the fire, and when Catherine wrapped it around her shoulders, she felt like she was putting on armor. "I'll be back before dawn," she promised. "And if you're not?" Catherine looked back at him one last time, memorizing his face in the firelight. "Then you'll know I made my choice." The shadow crouched beneath Catherine's bedroom window was not supposed to be there. She froze in the knee-deep snow behind her family's small house, Ezra's coat pulled tight around her shoulders, watching as the figure shifted position. Moonlight caught the glint of a badge on the man's chest, Deputy Collins, one of Sheriff Hawkins' most trusted men. They were waiting for her. Catherine's heart hammered as she realized how close she had come to walking straight into a trap. If she had climbed through her window as planned, she would have been caught before she could even light a candle. Instead, she crept around to the back door, testing each step to avoid the creaky boards she knew by heart. The kitchen was dark and still, but she could hear voices from the front room, low, urgent whispers that made her blood run cold. Pressing herself against the wall, she inched closer until she could make out the words. "Girl's been seen with the bank robber," Sheriff Hawkins was saying. "We have witnesses who saw them together in the alley behind Henderson's store." Catherine wouldn't do such a thing, her father protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's a good girl, works hard, minds her own business. Good girls don't run off with outlaws, Mills." This was Judge Morrison's voice, cold and certain. "Your daughter has brought shame on this entire family." Catherine's mother spoke up then, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Your Honor, she's just a child. If she's made a mistake, surely there's some way to make it right." "The only way to make this right is to bring her in," the sheriff said. "And the man she's protecting, where would she go, Mills? What places does she know outside of town?" Catherine held her breath, waiting for her father's answer. There was a long pause, filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the whistle of wind through the window frames. "I don't know," her father said finally. "She's never been more than 5 miles from this house in her whole life." It was true, Catherine realized. She had lived her entire 17 years within the boundaries of Millbrook and its surrounding farms. The world beyond was as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. How could she possibly survive out there with Ezra? "Think, man," Judge Morrison pressed. "Old buildings, abandoned places, anywhere a desperate girl might hide." "The Miller barn," her mother said suddenly. "She used to play there as a child, before the Millers moved away." Catherine's heart sank. She had been so clever, she thought, suggesting the barn to Ezra. But of course her mother would remember. Mothers remembered everything. "Send Collins and 2 men to check it out," the sheriff ordered. "If they're there, bring them back alive if possible. The girl might know where Stone hid the money." Catherine heard the scrape of chairs as the men prepared to leave. In minutes they would be riding hard for the Miller place, and Ezra would be trapped. She had to warn him, but how could she get away with Deputy Collins watching her window? The answer came to her as she spotted her little sister's coat hanging by the back door. Annie was small for her age, but the coat was oversized, meant to last several winters. If Catherine hunched her shoulders and pulled the hood up, she grabbed the coat and slipped out into the night, moving like a ghost through her own backyard. The deputy was still focused on the front of the house, watching for movement in the upstairs window. Catherine had played hide and seek in these streets her whole childhood. She knew every shadow, every shortcut, every place to disappear. But as she reached the edge of town, she heard the thunder of hoofbeats behind her. The sheriff's men were already riding out, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. They would reach the barn in 20 minutes, maybe less. Catherine began to run. The snow was deeper here, away from the protection of buildings. Each step sank past her knees, soaking through her thin stockings and numbing her legs. The borrowed coat flapped around her like broken wings, and Ezra's heavier coat underneath made her clumsy and slow. Her lungs burned in the frigid air, but she pushed forward, driven by desperation. Ezra had saved her life today, shown her kindness when no one else would. She couldn't let him be captured because of her mistake. The barn appeared ahead, a dark shape against the white landscape. Catherine could see the warm glow of firelight through the gaps in the walls, and her heart lifted. She wasn't too late. "Ezra!" she called out as she stumbled through the door. "They're coming. The sheriff knows about the barn." But the stall where Ezra had been sitting was empty. The fire still burned in its metal bucket, but there was no sign of the man or his horse. Only a piece of paper nailed to the wooden wall, with words written in a careful hand. "Catherine, if you're reading this, then they found you before you found me. I heard riders coming and had to leave. If you still want to come west, meet me at the old stone bridge over Miller's Creek. If not, I understand. You deserve better than a life on the run. Catherine stared at the note, her mind racing. Miller's Creek was 3 miles north, through some of the roughest country in the area. In this snow, in the dark, it would be nearly impossible to find. But if she didn't try, she would never see Ezra again. The sound of approaching horses made the decision for her. The sheriff's men were almost here, and she was trapped in the barn with nowhere to hide. Unless, Catherine grabbed a handful of straw and threw it on the fire. The flames leaped higher, catching the dry wood of the stall. Within seconds, the barn was filling with smoke. She ran for the back wall, where she remembered a loose board from her childhood adventures. The wood was warped with age and weather, and she managed to squeeze through just as the front door burst open. "Fire!" someone shouted. "The whole place is going up." Catherine rolled in the snow to put out the sparks on her clothes, then scrambled to her feet and ran into the darkness. Behind her, she could hear the sheriff's men shouting orders, trying to save what they could of the barn. But they were too late. The old building was already beyond saving. And Catherine Mills was already gone, swallowed by the night and the snow, following a path that would either lead to freedom or destroy her completely. The stone bridge over Miller's Creek looked like something from a fairy tale, its ancient arches draped with icicles that caught the moonlight like diamonds. Catherine stood shivering at the edge of the water, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Her feet were numb inside her thin boots, and frost had begun to form on the inside of Ezra's coat where her breath had frozen. No one was here. The bridge was empty, the surrounding woods silent except for the whisper of wind through bare branches. Maybe Ezra had already left, deciding she wasn't coming. Maybe he had been captured after all. Maybe this whole desperate journey through the snow had been for nothing. Then she heard it, the soft nickering of a horse, muffled by the trees. A moment later, Ezra stepped out of the shadows leading his mount, moving carefully on the icy stones. "Thought you might not come," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Thought you might not wait," Catherine replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. They stood looking at each other across the bridge, and Catherine realized this was the moment everything would change. Once she stepped onto those stones, there would be no going back. She would no longer be Catherine Mills of Millbrook, Nebraska. She would be someone else entirely, an outlaw's woman, a fugitive, a person without a home or a past. "I burned down the Miller barn," she said. Ezra's eyebrows rose. "On purpose. The sheriff's men were coming. I needed a distraction to get away." Catherine took a step onto the bridge, testing the slippery stones. "I suppose that makes me a criminal now too." "Welcome to the club," Ezra said with a smile. "Though I have to say, arson wasn't exactly what I had in mind for your first crime." Despite everything, Catherine found herself smiling back. "I'm a fast learner." "Good. You'll need to be." They met in the middle of the bridge, and Ezra helped her up onto his horse. The animal was strong and steady, bred for long journeys over rough country. Catherine settled behind the saddle, wrapping her arms around Ezra's waist as he urged the horse forward. "Where are we going?" she asked. "West," Ezra said. "Away from here, away from people who know our faces. I've got friends in Colorado territory, folks who don't ask too many questions about a person's past." Colorado territory. Catherine had heard the name before, but it might as well have been the moon. "How far?" 2 weeks hard riding if the weather holds. Longer if it doesn't. 2 weeks. Catherine tried to imagine it. Sleeping under the stars, eating beans from a can, no roof over her head or familiar faces around her. It was terrifying and exciting at the same time. They rode in silence for a while, following a game trail that wound through the hills north of Millbrook. The snow was lighter here, protected by the canopy of pine trees, and the horses' hooves made soft sounds on the frozen ground. "Tell me about your friends in Colorado," Catherine said, partly to keep her mind off the cold and partly because she wanted to know what kind of life awaited her. "Jim and Mary Carson," Ezra said. They run a small ranch in a valley near the mountains. Lost their only son in the war, and they've been taking in strays ever since. Folks who need a fresh start, a place to heal. Will they take us in? They'll take you in, Ezra said. Me, I'm not sure about. I've got too much blood on my hands for some people's taste. Catherine thought about this. How much blood? Enough. Ezra's voice was quiet. I'm not a good man, Catherine. I want you to understand that before we go any further. I've killed people, stolen from people, lied to people. Some of it was justified, some of it wasn't. But all of it was my choice. Are you going to hurt me? Catherine asked. No. Never. Then I don't care about the rest. They rode on through the night, leaving the familiar landscape of Catherine's childhood behind. She watched the stars wheel overhead, trying to memorize their patterns. Her mother had taught her some of the constellations, the Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, the North Star. Now those same stars would guide her to a new life. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they stopped to rest beside a small stream. Ezra unsaddled the horse and let it drink while Catherine gathered firewood. Her hands were clumsy with cold, but she managed to get a small fire going. You're tougher than you look, Ezra observed, watching her work. I've had to be, Catherine said. Growing up poor teaches you things about survival. What will you miss most about Millbrook? Catherine thought about this as she warmed her hands over the flames. My little sister, Annie. She's only 7, and she still believes in fairy tales. I used to read to her every night before bed. What kind of stories? Adventures, mostly. Princesses who saved themselves. Brave knights. Magic kingdoms where good always won in the end. Catherine looked up at Ezra. I never thought I'd be living in one of those stories myself. This isn't a fairy tale, Ezra warned. It's going to be hard, dangerous. There'll be times when you'll wish you'd never left home. Maybe, Catherine said, but there would have been times I wished I'd never stayed too. At least this way, I get to choose what happens next. Ezra nodded slowly. Choice is a luxury most people never get. They finished their meager breakfast and prepared to ride again. As Ezra helped Catherine back onto the horse, she looked back toward Millbrook one last time. Somewhere beyond those hills, her family was waking up to find her gone. Her mother would cry, her father would rage, her sister would ask questions no one could answer. But Catherine Mills was already becoming someone else, someone who didn't accept being beaten in alleys, someone who made her own decisions, someone who chose her own path. The girl who had worked in the cotton mill was gone forever, replaced by a woman who wore an outlaw's coat and rode toward an uncertain future. And for the first time in her life, Catherine felt truly free. The arrow that whistled past Catherine's ear missed her by inches, embedding itself in the pine tree behind her with a solid thunk. She threw herself off the horse just as 3 painted warriors emerged from the rocks above, their war cries echoing through the mountain canyon like the screams of hunting eagles. Stay down, Ezra shouted, rolling behind a boulder and drawing his gun in one smooth motion. The horse reared and bolted, taking their supplies with it into the maze of stone formations that filled this stretch of Colorado territory. Catherine pressed herself against the cold ground, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the attackers could hear it. 5 days of riding through wilderness had brought them to this narrow pass between towering red cliffs, and now they were trapped like rabbits in a snare. The warriors moved with deadly grace, using the rocks for cover as they closed in. Catherine caught glimpses of eagle feathers and painted faces, of bows drawn tight and knives that caught the afternoon sunlight. These weren't the peaceful tribes that sometimes traded with the settlements. These were fighters, and they looked like they meant business. What do they want? Catherine whispered. Our scalps, most likely, Ezra replied grimly, squeezing off a shot that sent sparks flying from the rocks above. We're in their territory without permission. A second arrow clattered off the stone near Catherine's head, followed by a voice speaking in rapid, angry words she couldn't understand. The tone was clear enough, though. They were not welcome here. Can we talk to them? Catherine asked, remembering stories she'd heard about negotiations with Indian tribes. With what? I don't speak their language, and they don't seem interested in conversation. Ezra reloaded his weapon with practiced speed. Our best chance is to make it to those rocks over there, then try to work our way back to higher ground. Catherine looked where he pointed and felt her stomach drop. The rocks were 30 yards away across open ground, with no cover between here and there. It might as well have been 30 miles. I can't run that far, she said. Not in this dress, not with these boots. Then we make our stand here. But even as Ezra spoke, more voices joined the first ones. The war party was growing, calling in reinforcements from somewhere deeper in the canyon. Soon they would be outnumbered 10-1, with no way out and limited ammunition. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to think. There had to be something, some way to communicate that they meant no harm. She thought about the stories her grandmother used to tell about the old days, when white settlers and Indians sometimes lived in peace. The coat, she said suddenly. What? Your coat. It's dark wool, expensive. Not the kind of thing a common thief would wear. Catherine's mind was racing now. And the cut is military. I can see it in the way it's tailored. You were a soldier, weren't you? Ezra's jaw tightened. Long time ago. Different war. Which side? Does it matter? It might. Catherine was already pulling the coat off her shoulders. If you fought for the Union, if you fought against slavery, maybe they'll see you as less of an enemy. It was a desperate hope, but desperation was all they had left. Catherine stood up slowly, holding the coat above her head like a flag. The shooting stopped immediately, and she could feel eyes watching her from the rocks. I don't think this is going to work, Ezra muttered. But Catherine was already walking forward, the coat stretched between her hands. She had no idea if the warriors would understand the gesture, but she had to try. With each step, she expected to feel an arrow between her shoulder blades. Instead, she heard a voice call out from above, different from the others, older and more measured. An argument seemed to break out among the warriors, voices rising and falling in rapid discussion. They're talking about us, Ezra said, rising slowly to his feet. That's something, at least. The older voice spoke again, this time in heavily accented English. You, woman, come forward. Alone. Catherine looked back at Ezra, who shook his head frantically. But she was already moving, the coat still held high. She had come too far to turn back now. The warrior who stepped out to meet her was older than the others, his face lined with years and wisdom. Feathers and beads decorated his hair, and his clothes were a mixture of traditional leather and traded cloth. He carried no weapons, but Catherine could see the strength in his shoulders, the alertness in his dark eyes. You are not afraid, he said, studying her face. I am afraid, Catherine admitted, but I'm more afraid of giving up. Something that might have been approval flickered in the warrior's expression. The man. He is your husband. Catherine glanced back at Ezra, who was watching tensely from behind his rock. He is my protector. Protector. The warrior seemed to taste the word. From what? From men who think they own me because I am poor. From a life that would have killed my spirit. Catherine held up the coat again. He gave me this when I was hurt and alone. He asked for nothing in return. The warrior examined the coat with careful eyes, noting the military cut and the quality of the wool. This man was a soldier. Yes. Blue coat or gray coat? Catherine's heart stopped. The wrong answer here could mean death for both of them. But she had to trust in the goodness she had seen in Ezra, the kindness that had saved her life. Blue coat, she said quietly. The warrior nodded slowly. The blue coats fought to free the slaves. They were enemies of the men who would make all people into property. He looked at Catherine with new interest. You understand this? I understand that some people think they can own other people. I understand what it means to be treated like property instead of like a human being. Yes, the warrior said. You understand. He turned and spoke rapidly to his men in their own language. Catherine caught the word soldier and what sounded like friend, but the rest was lost to her. The painted warriors lowered their weapons, though they remained watchful. We are Cheyenne, the older man said. I am Gray Wolf. We hunt the men who killed our women and children at Sand Creek. 3 winters passed. Blue-coat soldiers, but bad soldiers. Not all blue coats are bad. But these men. His face darkened. These men deserve to die. Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had heard whispers about Sand Creek, terrible stories that people spoke of in hushed voices. An attack on a peaceful village, women and children slaughtered, atrocities that shamed even the frontier's harsh standards. The man you travel with, Grey Wolf continued. He was at Sand Creek? I don't know, Catherine said honestly. He doesn't talk about his war. Grey Wolf studied her for a long moment, then called out to Ezra in English. Soldier, come forward. We would hear your words. Ezra approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. His face was pale, and Catherine could see the tension in every line of his body. Whatever memories Sand Creek held for him, they were not pleasant ones. Grey Wolf, Ezra said, nodding respectfully. I know that name. You led raids against the supply lines near Fort Lyon. You remember the Cheyenne way of war, Grey Wolf replied. That is good. It means you paid attention. It means you showed respect for your enemies. I tried to. Were you at Sand Creek? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Catherine held her breath, waiting for an answer that would determine whether they lived or died. I was there, Ezra said finally, but not as a fighter. I was a scout, sent to observe the village before the attack. I reported back that it was peaceful, that there were mostly women and children there. I told my commanders it would be murder, not war. And they listened? No. They attacked anyway. Ezra's voice broke slightly. I tried to stop some of the worst of it. Saved who I could. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Grey Wolf was quiet for a long time, studying Ezra's face with the intensity of a man reading a book written in a foreign language. Finally, he nodded. You have the eyes of a man who has seen too much death. The face of a warrior who fights against his own people's darkness. He gestured to his men, who began to fade back into the rocks. You may pass through our lands, but know this or other bands may not be so forgiving. The path you travel is marked with blood and sorrow. As the Cheyenne melted away into the landscape, Catherine felt the weight of what she had learned settling over her like a heavy blanket. Ezra was not just an outlaw running from the law. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of a war that had asked him to do terrible things. And somehow that made her trust him even more. The trading post that materialized out of the morning mist looked like something from a fever dream, a collection of rough wooden buildings clustered around a muddy courtyard, with smoke rising from multiple chimneys and the sound of hammering echoing off the surrounding hills. Catherine had never seen so many different kinds of people in one place. Welcome to Bent's Fork, Ezra said. Dismounting from the horse they had managed to recapture after the encounter with Grey Wolf's band. Last civilized stop before we hit the real wilderness. Catherine slid down from the saddle, her legs shaky after another long day of riding. Around them, the trading post bustled with activity that seemed chaotic but somehow organized. Mountain men in buckskin argued with Mexican traders in colorful serapes. Army soldiers loaded supplies onto wagons while their officers consulted maps. A group of emigrant families prepared their covered wagons for the journey west, children running between the wheels while their mothers packed and repacked their precious belongings. How many people pass through here? Catherine asked, amazed by the diversity of languages and accents she could hear. Hundreds every week during the traveling season, Ezra replied, leading their horse toward a corral. Everyone heading somewhere else, looking for something better than what they left behind. A familiar story, Catherine thought. Just like us. They made their way toward the main building, a long, low structure with a wide porch and windows that glowed with warm lamplight. The sign above the door read Bent's Fork Trading Post. Supplies, information, and honest dealing since 1858. Inside, the post was a treasure house of goods from across the continent. Shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from canned beans to silk ribbons, from ammunition to Chinese tea. The air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, coffee, and wood smoke. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like he had been carved from a tree trunk, broad shoulders, weathered face, and arms that could probably wrestle a bear. His hair was gray and his beard was full, but his eyes were sharp and alert as they took in the new arrivals. "Help you folks?" he asked in a voice like gravel. "Need supplies for the trail," Ezra said. "Food, ammunition, maybe some warmer clothes for the lady." The proprietor's gaze moved to Catherine, taking in her torn dress and worn boots. "First time heading west, miss?" "Yes, sir," Catherine replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Well, you picked a good guide. This here's Stone, isn't it?" The man extended a meaty hand to Ezra. "Name's Bent. Tom Bent. Heard you might be coming through." Catherine felt Ezra tense beside her. "Heard from who?" "Couple of federal marshals rode through here 3 days ago, asking questions about a bank robber and the girl he took with him." Bent's expression was unreadable. "Seemed real interested in finding you both." The trading post suddenly felt smaller, more dangerous. Catherine could see other customers glancing in their direction, and she wondered how many of them might be looking for reward money. "What did you tell them?" Ezra asked quietly. "Told them I see a lot of folks pass through here, and I make it a point not to remember faces too clearly." Bent leaned forward across the counter. "But I also told them that if I did happen to see a young couple matching their description, I'd be sure to let them know." Catherine's heart sank. They had walked into a trap. But Bent wasn't finished. "Course, I also mentioned that the nearest telegraph office is 100 miles from here, and my memory isn't what it used to be. Might take me a week or two to remember to send a message." Understanding dawned on Catherine's face. The man was offering them time, a chance to resupply and get ahead of their pursuers before he was obligated to report their presence. "That's mighty generous of you," Ezra said carefully. "I don't much like federal marshals," Bent replied with a shrug. "They ask too many questions and pay too little for information. Bad for business." "What kind of supplies do you have for travelers?" Catherine asked, playing along with the charade. "Depends on where you're heading and how fast you need to get there." Bent pulled out a ledger and began listing items. "Got dried meat, hardtack, coffee, blankets, ammunition. Also got some women's traveling clothes that came in last week." Previous owner decided she couldn't handle the frontier life and headed back east. As Bent showed them around the store, Catherine began to understand the complex social dynamics at work. The trading post was neutral territory, a place where people minded their own business and asked few questions. It was also a source of information. Bent clearly knew more about what was happening in the territory than most government officials. "Those marshals," Catherine said quietly while Ezra examined ammunition. "What else did they say?" "Said there was a reward posted. $500 for Stone. 200 for you." Bent's voice was casual, but his eyes were serious. "That's a lot of money in these parts. Enough to make honest men consider dishonest options. Are we safe here?" "For now. But word travels fast along the frontier telegraph. You know, the network of traders and mountain men who carry news from post to post. Every day you stay in one place makes it more likely someone will put 2 and 2 together." Catherine nodded, understanding the urgency. They needed to move fast, but they also needed to be smart about it. "There's something else," Bent continued, lowering his voice. "The marshals weren't the only ones asking questions. Had a group of men come through yesterday, rough types, not lawmen. They were asking about the bank robbery too, but they seemed more interested in the money than in bringing anyone to justice." "Bounty hunters?" Ezra asked. "Worse. These were the kind of men who shoot first and ask questions later. They find you, there won't be any arrest, any trial. Just a couple of bodies and a story about how you resisted capture." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had known their journey would be dangerous, but she hadn't fully grasped how many different kinds of danger they would face. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Day, maybe 2 if you're lucky. After that, this place will be crawling with folks looking to collect that reward money." Bent began gathering supplies, moving with the efficiency of long practice. "You'll want to take the high trail through Devil's Canyon. It's harder going, but it'll keep you away from the main routes where people might be watching." As they prepared to leave, Catherine found herself thinking about the life she had left behind in Millbrook. It seemed like a lifetime ago that her biggest worry had been Marcus Morrison and his friends. Now she was a wanted fugitive, running from federal marshals and bounty hunters, traveling through dangerous country with a man she had known for less than a week. And yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, she felt more alive than she ever had before. Every decision mattered. Every choice had consequences. Every day brought new challenges that tested her in ways she had never imagined. "You ready for this?" Ezra asked as they loaded their supplies onto the horse. Catherine looked back at the trading post, at the people going about their business, at the world of ordinary concerns and everyday problems. Then she looked ahead at the trail that wound up into the mountains, toward an uncertain future that was entirely their own to make. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. As they rode out of Bent's Fork, Catherine could feel eyes watching them from the windows of the trading post. Some of those watchers might be friends, others might be enemies, and most were probably just curious about the young couple heading into the wilderness. But for the first time since leaving Millbrook, Catherine felt like she was exactly where she belonged, on a horse beside a man who had shown her kindness, heading toward a future that held both danger and possibility in equal measure. The mountains rose before them like a promise, and Catherine Mills, bank robber's accomplice, fugitive from justice, and newly free woman, rode toward them with her head held high. The avalanche that roared down the mountainside sounded like the end of the world, a wall of snow and rock that swallowed everything in its path. Catherine pressed herself against the cliff face, watching in horror as the trail they had been following just minutes before disappeared under tons of white death. "Don't move," Ezra whispered, his arm pinning her against the cold stone. "Another sound could bring the whole mountain down on us." They had been climbing for 3 days through Devil's Canyon, following a narrow path that switched back and forth up the steep slopes. The air was thin here, making every breath a struggle, and the cold cut through their clothes like knives. But they had been making good time, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. Now they were trapped on a ledge barely wide enough for 2 people, with no way forward and no way back. The avalanche had taken out 100 yards of trail, leaving nothing but a sheer drop into the valley below. "How long do we wait?" Catherine asked, her voice barely audible. "Until the mountain settles. Could be hours, could be days." Ezra studied the slope above them, looking for signs of more instability. "We've got water for 3 days, food for 2 if we're careful." Catherine felt panic rising in her chest like flood water. 3 days on this ledge, exposed to the elements, with no guarantee that help would come or that the trail would ever be passable again. They could freeze to death, starve to death, or simply fall to their deaths if the ledge gave way. "There has to be another way," she said. "Maybe. But first we need to figure out what caused this." Ezra pointed to the destruction below. "Avalanches don't usually happen without a trigger. Could be the weather, could be an earthquake, or what? Or someone set it off on purpose." The thought hit Catherine like a physical blow. Someone had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to trap them on the mountain. But who? The federal marshals? The bounty hunters? Or someone else entirely? As if in answer to her question, a voice echoed from the rocks above. "Stone, I know you're down there." Catherine's blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar, though she couldn't place it at first. Then it came to her, Marcus Morrison, the judge's son who had beaten her in the alley back in Millbrook. "Surprised to see me?" Marcus called out, his voice full of cruel satisfaction. "Thought you could run away and nobody would follow? Thought you could steal from decent people and disappear into the wilderness? What do you want, Morrison?" Ezra shouted back. "What do I want? I want my money back, the money you stole from the bank. I want the girl who made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. And I want you dead." Marcus's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. In that order. Catherine's mind raced. Marcus was here, which meant he had somehow tracked them across hundreds of miles of wilderness. But how? And why would he care about the bank money? Unless— "The bank!" she whispered to Ezra. Morrison's father owned stock in the First National Bank. Understanding dawned in Ezra's eyes. He's not here for justice. He's here for revenge and profit. "That's right, Stone," Marcus called out. My father lost a lot of money when you robbed his bank. Money that was supposed to fund his campaign for territorial governor. You cost him more than just cash, you cost him his political future. So you decided to come after us yourself, Ezra said. Me and 6 of my best men. We've been tracking you since you left Nebraska. Took us a while to figure out your route, but that trader at Bent's Fork was very helpful once we explained the situation. Catherine felt sick. Tom Bent had seemed like a friend, but money talked louder than friendship in the wilderness. $700 in reward money was more than most people saw in a lifetime. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus continued. You're going to throw down your weapons and surrender. Then we're going to have a little chat about where you hid the money. After that, his voice trailed off into cruel laughter. And if we don't surrender? Ezra asked. Then you die slow instead of quick. Your choice. Catherine looked at Ezra, seeing the calculation in his eyes. 7 men against 1 with the high ground and superior position. The odds were impossible, but surrendering meant certain death anyway. How many shots do you have left? She whispered. Enough for a few of them. Not enough for all of them. Ezra checked his ammunition, his face grim. I'm sorry, Catherine. I should never have brought you into this. You didn't bring me into anything. I chose to come. Catherine surprised herself with how calm her voice sounded. And I'm not sorry. Even now? Even facing this? Catherine thought about her life in Millbrook, the mill, the poverty, the certainty that nothing would ever change. Then she thought about these past days with Ezra, the fear and danger balanced by a sense of freedom she had never known existed. Especially now, she said. A rock clattered down from above, followed by another. Marcus and his men were moving, positioning themselves for an attack. Soon bullets would start flying, and their tiny ledge would become a death trap. There, Ezra said suddenly, pointing to a crack in the rock face. It's narrow, but it might lead to another trail. Catherine looked where he was pointing and saw a vertical crevice in the cliff, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It disappeared into darkness, with no way to tell where it led or if it led anywhere at all. That's not a trail, she said. That's a death trap. Maybe, but it's better odds than staying here. Ezra was already moving toward the crack, testing its width with his shoulders. I'll go first, make sure it's safe. We go together, Catherine said firmly. If this is the end, we face it together. Ezra looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Together. The first gunshot rang out just as they squeezed into the crevice, the bullet sparking off the rock where Catherine's head had been a second before. More shots followed, echoing through the canyon like thunder. Find them, Marcus screamed from above. Don't let them escape. But Catherine and Ezra were already disappearing into the mountain's heart, swallowed by darkness and stone, following a path that might lead to freedom or might lead to their graves. Behind them, the shouts of their pursuers grew fainter and fainter, until there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the whisper of wind through hidden passages. In the darkness, Catherine reached out and found Ezra's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and reassuring. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And somehow that made even the darkness seem less frightening. The underground river that rushed through the heart of the mountain sounded like a living thing, its voice echoing off cavern walls that disappeared into blackness above their heads. Catherine had never imagined such a place could exist. A world beneath the world, carved by water and time into something both beautiful and terrifying. Stay close to the wall, Ezra warned, his voice barely audible over the rushing water. One wrong step and the current will take you. They had been following the underground passage for hours, feeling their way through the darkness with hands and feet. The crevice they had squeezed through had opened into a network of caves and tunnels, some so narrow they had to crawl, others so vast their voices echoed for seconds before fading into silence. Catherine's dress was torn and filthy now, her hands scraped raw from the rough stone. But she felt more alive than ever, every sense heightened by the constant danger. The air here was different, thin and cold, with a metallic taste that spoke of deep places and ancient secrets. How do you know where we're going? she asked. I don't, Ezra admitted. But water always finds a way out. If we follow the river, it should lead us to daylight eventually. Eventually. The word hung between them like a question mark. They had been underground for what felt like days, though it was impossible to tell time in the eternal darkness. Their food was gone, their water nearly finished. Soon they would have to drink from the river itself with no way to know if it was safe. Tell me about the ranch, Catherine said, partly to keep her mind off their situation and partly because she needed something to hope for. The place in Colorado where your friends live. The Carson place? It's beautiful, a valley surrounded by mountains, with a stream running through it and meadows full of wildflowers in the spring. Ezra's voice softened as he spoke. Jim built the house himself, cut every log and fitted every joint. Mary has a garden that grows vegetables bigger than anything you've ever seen. Do you think they'll really take us in? I think they'll take you in. You're exactly the kind of person they help, someone who needs a fresh start, a chance to build a new life. Ezra paused. Me, I'm not so sure about. I've got too much blood on my hands. You saved my life, Catherine said firmly. You showed me kindness when no one else would. That has to count for something. They walked in silence for a while, following the river's edge through passages that seemed to go on forever. Sometimes the ceiling dropped so low they had to duck. Other times it soared beyond the reach of their voices. The water beside them was black as ink, moving with the slow power of something that had been flowing for thousands of years. There, Ezra said suddenly, pointing ahead. Do you see that? Catherine strained her eyes and saw it. The faintest hint of gray in the darkness ahead, like dawn breaking through storm clouds. Light! Light! They moved faster now, hope giving strength to their tired legs. The passage began to slope upward, and the sound of the river changed, becoming sharper, more urgent. Fresh air touched their faces, carrying scents of pine and snow and the vast outdoors. The cave mouth opened onto a ledge high above a valley Catherine had never seen before. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks white with snow, and far below a river wound through meadows that would be green in spring but now lay brown and dormant under winter's grip. Where are we? Catherine asked, breathing the clean air like wine. East of the divide, I think. Maybe 50 miles from where we started. Ezra studied the landscape, getting his bearings. That's the South Platte down there, which means we're closer to the Carson place than I thought. They had done it. They had escaped Marcus Morrison and his men, crossed the mountains, and found their way to the other side. But even as relief flooded through her, Catherine realized their journey was far from over. How do we get down? She asked, looking at the sheer drop below. Carefully, Ezra said. Very carefully. The descent took the rest of the day, following game trails and rocky ledges that seemed to lead nowhere but somehow always opened onto the next possibility. Catherine's hands were bleeding by the time they reached the valley floor, and her legs shook with exhaustion. But they were alive, they were free, and they were together. The Carson place is 2 days' walk upstream, Ezra said, helping her to her feet. We can make it if we're careful. What if they're not there? What if they've moved on? Then we find another way, Ezra said simply. We keep going until we find a place where we can stop running. They camped that night beside the river, building a small fire from driftwood and sharing the last of their jerky. The stars overhead were brighter than Catherine had ever seen them, undimmed by the smoke and lights of civilization. I've been thinking, she said, watching the flames dance, about what you said, about having too much blood on your hands. Catherine, no, let me finish. She turned to face him across the fire. You've killed people, stolen from people, done things you're not proud of. But you've also saved people, protected people, shown kindness to a stranger when you didn't have to. It doesn't balance out, Ezra said quietly. Maybe not, but it matters. The man who gave me his coat, who helped me escape, who's been protecting me ever since, that man is worth saving. That man deserves a chance at a better life. Catherine's voice was firm, certain. And I'm going to make sure he gets it. Ezra looked at her across the fire, and something in his expression changed. You really mean that? I really do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the river and the wind in the trees. Tomorrow they would continue their journey, searching for a place where they could build a new life together. There would be challenges ahead, dangers they couldn't imagine, choices that would test them in ways they had never been tested before. But tonight, beside the fire under the stars, Catherine Mills felt something she had never felt before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. The coat that had started it all lay folded beside her, a reminder of the moment when a stranger's kindness had changed everything. Tomorrow she would wear it again as they walked toward their future, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important journey is not to a place, but to an understanding of who you really are. And Catherine Mills finally knew who she was, not a victim, not property, not someone to be used and discarded, but a woman who had chosen her own path and was brave enough to walk it, no matter where it led. The fire burned down to embers, and they slept under the stars, dreaming of the life they would build together in the valley that waited ahead.